Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third Women in Water lecture series for 2021. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are participating today from the traditional territories of the First Peoples across Canada. The University of Saskatchewan is located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6, the traditional territory of the Cree and the homeland of the Métis. Please take a moment with yourself to acknowledge the land where you live and work, and give appreciation for providing this setting for today's positive discussion. I am Andrea Rowe, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist at the Global Institute for Water Security and Global Water Futures at the University of Saskatchewan. I would like to start today's event by covering a few brief logistics. If you would prefer to listen in French, you can do so by clicking on the globe interpretation button in the bottom right-hand corner. The event will also be captioned today in English. If you would like to listen to the captions, please click on the CC button. The event will be approximately 1 hour in length, and we will be recording the event in both English and French. And we will be sharing today's event on the GWF YouTube channel if you would prefer to watch it later. In the last 20 minutes, there will also be an opportunity for questions and answers. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to pop your questions in there, and we will get to them at the latter part of the discussion. I'd like to also recognize our sponsors for today's event: the Global Water Futures Young Professionals, Global Water Futures, and the Global Institute for Water Security, for committing the resources to make not only today's lecture, but this series, the Women in Water series, possible in 2021. And especially to our virtual audience, the young professionals who are attending today from all universities, but especially the University of Saskatchewan, Laurier, Waterloo, and McMaster. About the Women in Water lecture series. This lecture series was conceived in response to the recognition that we need more opportunities to showcase women researchers in water sciences and to provide leadership opportunities for young professionals. It was also conceived to draw attention to the gendered nature of water and the need to include gender-based research and analysis. Each of our lectures focuses on a specific water-related theme. Today's structured conversation focuses on valuing water, which is also the theme for the UN World Water Day, March 22nd, 2021. The theme of valuing water is going to be explored in different ways this month, and I encourage you to also check out the panel hosted on World Water Day by our colleagues at Let's Talk About Water, and for another important perspective by the events hosted by Global Water Futures. The value of water is fundamentally linked to our social, economic, spiritual, cultural, and environmental health, and like air, to life itself. And so how do we begin to place a value on something that is vital to all living things? What impact does gender have on the way that water is valued? To answer some of these questions and many more, I'm delighted to introduce our guests for today. Diane DuPont is a professor of economics at Brock University, where she has held the Chancellor's Chair for Research Excellence and Water and was awarded the Brock University Distinguished Research and Creative Activity Award. She is also a member of Brock's Environmental Sustainability Research Center and the Scientific Director of the Water Economics Policy and Governance Network, a SSHRC partnership grant from 2016 to 2020. Her research program concentrates upon examining ways to encourage more efficient and sustainable use of water resources, both on the supply and demand side. And second, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Diana Karanja. Dr. Karanja is a widely published medical researcher with experience of over 30 years working with the Kenyan Medical Research Institute, while collaborating with international universities in Canada, Japan, Europe, the United States, as well as global institutions, including the World Health Organization and the United Nations. She's the director of a national non-governmental organization in Kenya, whose focus is on community health and well-being. She's extremely interested in youth mentorship. So very warm welcome to both Diane DuPont and Diana Karanja. And I'm going to begin by inviting each of our guests to make a short presentation about their current work, to provide background and context for how they value water in their work before we proceed on to the panel discussion. So I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Diane DuPont, and she will begin by telling us about how she values work and her life at Brock University. Thank you.
the territorial land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Specifically, I live in Port Dalhousie, which is a small community right by Lake Ontario. I won't say this is my view from my house, rather this is a view from about a 5-10 minute walk away. And it gives you a sense of where water is in my particular life. So if I could ask you to advance the slide, thanks very much. So I want to give a bit of overview first. There are kind of 5 topics I want to address, and I'll be launching into each of them in a moment. But I want you to think first of all about water as a valuable resource. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about a framework which is a useful framework for putting into context the myriad ways in which water touches our lives. And that's called the Total Economic Value Framework. And that's really important. And I will be speaking later on about the fact that there are so many ways that water touches our lives that it's inevitable that there are times in which one way that we want to use water or enjoy water will come into conflict with another way that we might want to enjoy or use water, or how someone else might want to. I think that's a really important perspective to keep in mind. Then I'll talk a little bit about how values are expressed. And because this session is really about women in water, I want to talk a little bit about where there might be some gender differences within the framework, the context of the Total Economic Value Framework. And then I'll just have a few comments to sum up. So if I could ask you to advance, thanks very much, Andrea. So first of all, let's talk about water as a valuable resource. Water is an asset that many countries are very fortunate to have. Canada obviously is extremely fortunate to be blessed with the abundance of water that it has. And it's an asset, though, that provides many goods and services. And I'm going to speak a little bit more specifically about the types of goods and services in just a moment. But I want to put that idea in your mind. It's not a sole usage item or a sole usage resource. Typically, it's government owned. And when I say owned, it really is government managed, owned on behalf of the citizens of the country. And the goal is to provide the highest value of benefits to citizens from being able to enjoy this asset, enjoy this resource. Could you please advance, Andrea? Thanks. So let me talk a little bit about the Total Economic Value Framework. And this is the way where we can kind of look at both the myriad ways that water provides benefits to people and has value for people, but it also lays into very stark contrast where conflicts might arise when the wishes of one set of people conflict with the wishes of another set of people over the use of water. And so if we think about the Total Economic Value Framework, it basically breaks down the values of water or the benefits of water into those that we call active use versus passive use benefits. So they're 2 different kinds. And moreover, it lets us think about not just at this point in time about the benefits or the value of water, but also potential future benefits of water. And remember, again, when I spoke about conflicts between different people wanting to use water, I was kind of focusing on, at that point, conflicts that are at a particular moment in time, let's say right now. But nonetheless, there are also conflicts that can occur when our use of water currently has impacts upon the benefits a future generation might be able to enjoy. So those are important concepts to keep in mind. Could you please advance? And I think this is the slide which has, so a moment ago, I spoke about how lucky we are in Canada to be blessed with so much water. This is a photograph from Johnson Creek Lower Falls in Banff National Park in Alberta. And it gives you a sense of where there is also water, not just from the Great Lakes, which is near where I live, but also other parts of Canada. And I think this picture is really important because it actually encapsulates a lot of what I want to talk about in the next slide, which is going to be the Total Economic Value Framework. That's great. So if you recall, I talked about the fact that if we think about the total economic value of water, at the highest level, we can break that into 2 categories, what we call active use values. So that's on the left-hand side of the diagram, and passive use values on the right-hand side of the diagram. And then if we focus in on active use values, we can kind of categorize them according to different ways in which people use water. And specifically, we can think about what are called direct use values or direct uses of water, indirect uses of water, and then option value uses of water. And so most of us are very familiar with direct use values or direct uses of water. For example, every time water is extracted, is taken out of the ground and used for irrigation purposes, that's an extractive use of water. There are also non-extractive uses of water. So water that's used in situ, typically water that doesn't have to travel from one location to another. And so you can see the users, if you will, it says users, it's kind of industries, agriculture, fisheries, domestic water utilities, municipalities, industrial users, all of those different users take advantage of the resource water, typically to turn the water or to combine the water with something else to make products that we enjoy and that we buy in a market. Then there are indirect use values. Now, these are more kind of functional benefits. And so there are a number of different categories under there you can think about. I suspect the one that most people are familiar with are using water for recreational purposes or for tourism purposes. But there are other ways in which we indirectly use water. So right now, we're very interested in issues around ecosystem services. So for example, water provides purification. When we dump sewage into water, if the body's big enough, you get purification of the water. Alternatively, certain water provides also flood services, so benefits that protect us from flooding situations. And so there are a number of different ways in which it's less tangible, our understanding of how we benefit from water. And that then moves us into the next category, which are the option values. And those are kind of future or forward thinking, and they involve the kinds of benefits that we've just talked about, the direct and the indirect use, but into the future. So not using right now, but possibly us or future generations wanting to enjoy water. That's active use. That's tangible, quite tangible. The other values, which are equally important, if not more so, are passive use values. And these are much less tangible and as we'll talk about, much more difficult to put a value on. And essentially these come down to two things, both forward-looking, both looking into the future. Bequest values, so possibly wanting to have our children enjoy water benefits into the future. And then there's a whole category of existence values, not wanting to use water in any kind of active or indirect or direct sense, but just knowing that water exists in a particular form. So I live, for example, probably about a 20-minute drive away from Niagara Falls. Just knowing that it has a continued existence has value for me and for many people. Could we move on to the next slide, Andrea, please? So how are values expressed? So if you think back, what is a value? It's something we are willing to give up in order to get something else. That expresses how much we value, what the value we place on something. And typically in economics, we think of how much of one resource, typically dollars, a consumer is willing to give up to purchase or obtain another good. We can also sometimes think, though, of values being expressed in terms of labor time. So in many developed countries, typically water is purchased for use using dollars in exchange. In a lot of developing countries, water is obtained by giving up one's time, so one's labor. One has to walk to a borehole, for example, to collect water. So we can think about those as being expressing values. Could you please move it again, please, Andrea? However, here's the challenge. Many goods and services provided by water, particularly the indirect ones and definitely the passive use ones, are not bought and sold in a market setting. So we don't have estimates of those values. And to get those, we need to use non-market valuation methods to elicit those values. And I'll speak about that a little bit more as we go on in the question and answer period. So could you move it again, please? So let's talk about women and total economic value. I'm going to break this down into looking at those two main categories and just give you some things to think about where there might be differences between men's and women's valuation. Let's talk first about active direct use. So here are two examples of active direct use of water. One is the purchase of agricultural goods that have been produced with water. So you go to a grocery store, you purchase produce, much of it has been produced with water. And the other example is a payment of a water or sewage bill. If you own a home, or even if you rent a property, sometimes you're paying for your water and sewage, the water that comes into your home. In those cases, the price per unit paid for women and men is the same. There's no distinction between them. Where differences might arise is in terms of the amounts that are used. And so if you think about the total benefits, it's the price times the quantity. If the prices are the same, but the quantities are different, then you're getting a different measure of total benefits associated with the direct use. And now this becomes more important here if we think to the example of developing countries where time is being used in exchange to obtain water. If men's and women's labor is valued differently, we're going to see differences in the value contributions made by men and women. And that's a really important thing to understand, because there are structural problems with the fact that men and women are paid differently for same types of work. Could you move it on to the next slide, please, Andrea? So let's think about active indirect use then. So again, are there differences here? Well, this is really interesting because there is some literature, I've done some work myself, in which we've tried to get at women's valuation of specifically water benefits from recreational activities. And we find that women, especially women with children, tend to have much higher values, what we call willingness to pay for better water quality. So they're more willing than men with both men with and without children to have a higher value. And that's an important thing to understand, that there may be different, what we call preferences, depending upon your gender. Similarly, and I know Diana is going to speak much more about this, if we think about health benefits, and that's a huge category of the indirect benefits that we obtain from especially good quality water. In this particular case, both the willingness to pay, so how much women are willing to pay versus men, and the total benefits in terms of how the water may impact women's health versus men's health differently are really, really important. And we see this. Could you please put it on to the next slide, Andrea? And finally, passive use. So these benefits are very real to people. So these existence values, these kind of bequest values, and they're made better. These values are real to people because these people are made better by water services. But the big challenge becomes for us is to measure them, to get an estimate of just how important they are, because they're not as tangible as other benefits. And I think I've got one last slide, Andrea, which just kind of sums everything up. Thanks. So water is unique. It's a precious resource. We need to really think well about how we manage it. Water is also really, in addition to providing many types of goods and services to people, it has multiple attributes. So water is not just water, it's the quantity of water, it's the quality of water, it's the location in which the water is found, it's the time period in which the water is made available. So all of those things make it a really complex resource to be looking at. Water values are heterogeneous. We know that people have different preferences. There is evidence that women have different preferences from men, different willingness to pay. And it's really important that we understand all of the suite of water values, not just the active direct ones that we can get from a marketplace, but really what are the passive use values? Because if we want to be managing water appropriately, not just now, but for the future, we need to understand those values, because we're always making decisions about how much water to use. And at the end of the day, we want to provide the highest value of benefits to citizens that we can. And thanks very much.
Great.
That's it for me for now.
Thank you so much, Diane. That's very, very interesting. And we look forward to carrying this conversation on now with Diana.
Okay, so thank you so much. Also, I'm really delighted to be invited this, and I'm really looking forward to the kind of discussions we're going to have. So picking up from where Diane has left off, she has spoken about the methods of measurement of valuing water. And I'm just gonna go and sort of focus on the kind of work we do in Lake Victoria region, and focus on women, because we work a lot with women and water around the lake. And to begin with also, I'd just like to, the next slide, please, to talk about where we are located. So we are located in Kenya around the Lake Victoria region in a town called Kisumu. And the Lake Victoria region, the lake itself is a big lake, but the Kenyan part of the lake is a very small, maybe just like 6% of the total lake. But a lot of the rivers that feed into the lake are actually from Kenya. The next one, please. So Lake Victoria is the source of the Nile. And the reason why I'm trying to focus on this as well is when we come later to talk about maybe transboundary issues, this is a very good example of where you have activities around one region, but the impact of those activities like around the lake will impact a lot of people, because the Lake Victoria feeds into the Nile. And when we talk about the Nile basin, we're talking about 10 countries. So what happens, say, in Uganda can actually impact what happens in Egypt. So it's a big area, and it's very important to think about what sort of activities do people use around this lake? What are their values for the water? What are they willing to pay for it? What are they willing to, to think of it as a resource that they're sharing with other people? The next slide, please. Next.
Yes, there we go.
So this is slides that are just zeroing in on our kind of work. So we work around the basin, Lake Victoria. If you look around, it's a very small area of the lake, but because it's a bay area and a lot of towns are located around that area, there's a lot of impact on the lake. And some of the villages we work in are also extremely nested in a small area surrounded by the lake. The next. So what kind of work do we do? What kind of activities do we deal with? The bottom line is actually thinking about, if you think about the United Nations targets for water, what we are trying to look at is safe, affordable water for communities, for rural communities specifically. We focus on rural communities. And a lot of this is concerning women. So in looking for affordable and safe water, some of the assumptions that are made initially are like the government will provide water, which it doesn't always do. So how do you lobby for water? When you're lobbying for water for rural communities, how involved are these communities in lobbying for water? Because if you're going to lobby for water, we make certain assumptions. We make that they value this water enough for them to also participate in the lobbying of water, to actually want that water to reach their homes. So you can also we also look at supporting alternative water sources in situations where this piped water, because we always think like the basic solution is to have piped water into your home. But supposing you don't have that, a lot of communities don't have that. Is it because they don't value that water, or is it because they just can't afford it? So you look at supporting alternative water sources, and then you go even lower and look at local solutions, and with a focus on drinking water. You look at source water and how contaminated is it? Do you need to treat it when it gets into the homes? And then we look at the water health nexus. In the Lake Victoria region, like for many years, I've worked on schistosomiasis, which is a waterborne disease. We worked on diarrhea cases. This is the water health nexus. Just how important is it for these rural communities? Is it enough for them to feel like, okay, this water, we need to pay for it, the costing of the water when evaluating it? And then we also look at the rural women and their finance. because we find that a lot of water activities are conducted by women. They're the ones impacted a lot. They're the ones to go to the lake to collect water. They're the ones to go to the rivers to collect water. But do they have the finances to do it? How, in terms of, like Diane talked about the differences between men and women, do the women have the finances? Do the men value it enough? Or do they say, okay, the woman will get the water? So they may not really feel the need to pay for the water closer to the home. So we look at rural women and their financing and how much they can actually afford water. So in our programs, most of the households are headed by men. Women also only contribute about 18% of household heads. So decisions made are usually made by the men. We have in these rural communities, you find that women get married quite early also. So you have a whole range of household heads. You have young women heading households. You have old, the elderly heading households. And the access to water is usually like, if you're too old, how do you access water? If you're too young, do you have the finances to actually afford water? And how much money do these people spend on this water? This has to do with their value, how much they value this water, what value they place on the different water sources. Next. So we look at what do these communities use the lake for, directly and indirectly. So directly you find, like, we have in the towns, you have people like they're washing cars in the lakes, they're doing domestic duties in the lake, they're fishing in the lakes. So everything, the lake is like the central point of this community. And so what impact does that have? And actually, what kind of value do they attribute to this? And you see the difference here between, like, the guys who are washing in the lake, these are men. The people who have to walk to the lake to do household duties, these are women. The people who go fishing, these are men. But the people who collect the fish and go to sell, these are women. So they attribute probably different values to their direct use of the lake. Next. And then also, when we think of the value of the lake, we also look at the inflowing rivers. You remember earlier on I said there are a lot of rivers, maybe close to 8 rivers, that bring water inflow into the Lake Victoria region. Before it hits the lake, what is happening to this water? And the people upstream, how are they valuing this water? So we find now in these inflowing rivers, you have more of agricultural use for the lake water, and that's a different value to it. Next. Next slide. So you have individual users of water for the lake, and then you also have community users. So as a community and as an individual, what kind of values do you attach to this water? If you look at it as a community use, is it looked at as more valuable, or is it looked at as less valuable as that individual need for the water? You have schools using the water, you have health services, people using the water for health services and so forth. So this also will bring in I hope this can bring in an interesting discussion on community use versus individual use and the valuation of water based on individuality and community use as well. Next. So in terms of the interesting thing about the value of water, often, like, organizations, when we move into communities and we want to change their lives, and we want to give them safe water, and we want to do all kinds of things, and we bring in interventions. These interventions, they're based on the value. The success of these interventions are based on how the communities view this. For example, our organization does wells for communities. And this really has a lot of difference when you move from community to community. Some places you go and put in a well, and the community will take it and they will maintain it. And if you go back a couple of years later, you'll find the well is functional and they're taking care of it. When you move to other communities, you'll put in a well, and if you go back a year later, you'll find it is not used, it is in disrepair, and the people have gone back to collecting water to the lake. So there's this, as a community, you feel like there's no value as a community to safe water that you are trying to bring them. Next slide. Other interventions, the same way as you'll make like wells, you decide to put like filters. And our experience here have shown that where women are really impacted, you find that they are forming a lot of women groups. These women groups are assisting with income generation so that they can afford to buy the filters. You see a lot of difference between men and women in these areas. A lot of men don't like to join these women groups, and they don't care if they have safe water in their house, but the women will go to a lot of lengths to join these women groups so that they can afford filters, and they'll try all kinds of filters. When you bring in interventions, they will attempt them. So this is just showing some of the women groups getting together and trying for finances that can bring them value for safe water. Next slide. And safe water, one of the biggest values for women is their families. There is a lot of diarrhea in these regions, and one of the biggest incentives is the children. So you find that whatever they have realized that whatever they drink, whatever is available is what their babies will drink, is what their children will drink, is what their families will drink. And this now brings into question the water health nexus. And I hope we can have a good discussion on that as well. Providing information seems to have a big impact on the changes of the value, changes that the community has on the value of water, especially safe water. Next slide. So our biggest query is, how do you get these rural women to participate in water valuation? You find a lot of them are using untreated water, but you want to get them to a point where they're using clean water, but they need to value that before they can participate as stakeholders. So you have different kinds of stakeholders, and we feel that it's very, very critical to get the rural woman to participate in water valuation, so that in the end, the success of programs that the government is trying to do, that other organizations are trying to do, can be successful, not just because you want the NGOs and the government want it to happen, but because the rural women have valued that safe water to a point where they are willing actually to pay money to acquire that safe water. Next slide. So just quickly to go through, like at the moment, what is happening in terms of community participation in valuation of water. So for now, it's still very low. And this is based on like, are there any community meetings? Are there any WASH program meetings that can create an opportunity for these women to participate in valuation of water, so that they can now be willing to move forward, to give ideas, to say what they value, what they use their water for. So we find that community WASH meetings are still very, very low. So there's low stakeholder involvement in decision making at this level. So if you ask them, like over 77% of our program participants have never, attended a WASH meeting. Next slide. And although if you go to communities, although they feel like sometimes they need water and they need water close to home and they need safe water, many of them do not have, they don't even take this information further to the governance, to the community leaders, to tell them this is what we want. So this is what we would like to increase, and this is what we would like to get the communities to participate, to be strong stakeholders in the valuation of water. The next slide, please. So if we look at just roughly the value of water and how different stakeholders view it. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. Now governments pick up this and they say, okay, yeah, this is a really good thing. We need to have universal safely managed water and sanitation to our people. And they embrace this, and they need to make policies so that this can be implemented successfully. But now for these successful policies to take place, you need to get all the stakeholders involved. And we feel that these rural women need to be incorporated into these stakeholders, so that even if you're talking about universal, safely managed water for all, you need to realize that for it to reach the masses, everybody has to be involved. Next slide. In this, hopefully we can have good discussions on this question. Is like decision makers and power dynamics. This is what impacts how rural communities participate in water valuation. Because the question is, who does the valuation? Who determines like the negative impacts of water scarcity, pollution, flooding, waters, and health? And when say like the United Nations makes these policies, there are certain presumptions that are made. Who makes these presumptions? What kind of presumptions are made in order to have these outcomes of their decisions? You find that policymakers are often the ones who make these decisions. In the communities, you find that there are all kinds of breakdowns in traditional power dynamics. So people are not able to participate as stakeholders. So when we want to do stakeholder participation in water valuations, we need to identify these power dynamics so that they can be addressed, starting from authentic, free participation and putting in a situation where that everybody is heard. Not just like sometimes like we saw earlier, you can have meetings, but you don't get enough participation. Sometimes people are afraid to speak up. So you need a way in which you can break down these power dynamics where one person feels like, oh, I can attend this meeting, but I cannot speak, you know. So these are the kind of power dynamics that need to be dealt with. And it can include the elderly. You find a lot of elderly, they have ideas, they know what has been happening over generations. You have young people in the rural areas, you have young people in the rural areas, you have urban people. So there are all kinds of different participants who need to be captured within this water valuation. And finally, the last slide, I think. So we find that, you know, low-income rural women in our communities are willing to participate in water valuation, but they need to be captured. And finally, the last slide. So like we said, you know, water is life and water is a human right. In our communities, the burden of availing water is completely borne by women. So they need to be aware of the value of water. They don't need to take it like for granted, which is what happens a lot. Takes it for granted. And it is important to discuss the issue of valuing water so that they can critically look at their uses of water and know that they can actually participate in the final policy decisions. And I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana, for those insightful presentations. It really shows how many complex issues there are in valuing water. And I wanted to begin by asking you, something that you both touched upon in your presentations, which is how do transboundary issues impact water usage in your work?
Well, I think, Diana, you should go first on this one. I think you've got a lot more to say about this than I do.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, you see, transboundary issues, like in our communities, you know, it's a shared resource. So if we look in terms of like water quality, allocation of water to riparian countries, irrespective of the country, and this is very important, like in the region where we work in. For example, you get a lot of like across border conflicts. You find a lot of across border conflicts. This water is shared, for example, like fishing, and different countries allocate different amounts of, you know, like areas of fishing, and it creates a lot of conflict. This happens a lot between, there's examples of Kenya and Uganda there as well, actually. And then you have issues of pollution, you know, with a lot of towns. When you have a shared resource like this, as I mentioned earlier, if you have industrial waste, if you have all kinds of organic pollution, these are rural folks, there's a lot of like water and sanitation issues, and they see no boundary. Once you pollute that water, it flows into the next country, and it flows down the river, and it flows to, like we mentioned, like 10 countries. If you have issues like what do you call it, like disease across, across it knows no boundary. So we find that a lot of transboundary issues create a lot of conflicts between, among these riparian communities. You find, for example, even if you take like the Nile Basin, you find that, say, Egypt has allocated itself so much water. They say Egypt must use so much water. So they say, if you live around Lake Victoria, you have to limit the amount of irrigation you're using for water because Egypt must have so much water. So there's a lot of transboundary issues that affect what happens to the communities around the lake.
Mm-hmm. So Canada has transboundary issues, but only with one state, well, with the United States, because there are shared water resources. The Great Lakes is one, but then there are also rivers that flow back and forth across the two countries. And we have a treaty, the Boundary Waters Treaty, that was signed in 1909. So it's been around for a long time, that basically sets out the principles under which the shared resources will be used. And it's traditionally been more concerned about water quality. So a lot of farms are located around the Great Lakes, for example. There's been a lot of eutrophication, a lot of pollution issues. And so right now there are ongoing conversations about how to ensure the water quality in the Great Lakes is not damaged in a permanent kind of way. So it's a much less challenging issue, I would say, than Diana's, with so many different countries, because every time you get another country involved, you've got governance issues that will come to the fore, and you've got kind of past practices that are important, and that just magnifies the problem tenfold, or more than that, I think.
And I think you've both touched on this in your talks, but now not in addition to multiple countries, but within country, how do you balance all of the diverse stakeholders that play a role in valuing water? Because as we've seen in your talks, there's so many different stakeholders and ways that people use water, and so how does that sort of impact the value, maybe the economic value? We'll start with you, Diane.
Sure. Well. So let me give you a very concrete example. If you think back to the total economic value framework, where essentially we've got active use values and passive use values, we've got a lot of numbers for at least a portion of the active use values. So those numbers are used in decision making. We have very few values or numbers that can be used in contrast to it. So what ends up happening, of course, is that when decisions are being undertaken, the values that are most easily accessible are being used to forward those decisions, and other values are not being considered.
And how does that contrast with the experience in your work, Diana?
I think maybe to add something to that is, I would look at it like also the imbalance of stakeholder power. So because you have all these stakeholders, from governments to businesses, to all kinds of legislators, to property developers. So sometimes you'll find the value of some stakeholders. They like I talked about power dynamics. So you find the person who wants to build a dam across certain water may have a greater influence. Their value for that water takes on a bigger influence than the person, just the common person who lives around and doesn't have that much power to input. So, so that power imbalance that's why you need to bring different stakeholders all along, so that there is transparency in what sort of values are going into these final policies.
And those power dynamics are very interesting, and I think in your talk, it really, it's interesting to think about youth and elderly and all of these different groups that are using water. Do you find that there are certain ways that can help redistribute the power or help to people to engage to overcome those power dynamics, or is this just ongoing sort of challenges?
I think part of, I think knowledge makes a big change. When you talk to people about what is going on, make them aware. Like I mentioned earlier, if you go to the rural areas, people don't think about the value of water. They take it for granted. But once they start realizing, this water is really, really critical to you, and you need to express the value that you have for this water, and you need to escalate it to a point where it takes on a big value, and you need to demand to be incorporated into water valuation. It's a challenge. It is a challenge because like businesses always, of course, will they have more power dynamics than the rural folks. But I think knowledge, just making them aware that they can play a role, and they can push and they can lobby for their values for water, even if it is, like they mentioned earlier, even if it's a cultural value, or if it's a religious value, that you need to say, this is what I value in this, and I would like to be incorporated in, that kind of thing. And so I think knowledge and making people aware of their ability to participate, I think, is very critical.
No, exactly, and I think in your talk, Diane, you mentioned the total values framework, but are there other methodologies that you use to value water that are perhaps used by communities or that are accessible to people?
Accessible to people, yes. So within the total economic value framework, there are kind of two kinds of approaches, I guess I would say, of methodologies for obtaining the values of water that are not readily available in a market. As an economist, we tend to look, first of all, what does the market tell us about how much people are willing to pay? But there are a lot of different instances in which water has value, but is not expressed within a market. And so let me give you one example of what's called an indirect approach. And so if we think about how we would value the indirect approach, let's say recreational activity of water. I was thinking back to actually your men who are fishers and boaters and things like that, Diana. So if we think about that, how would we express the value that they place on water? Well, they're using water with other goods, a boat, maybe some fishing gear and things like that, to enjoy themselves or possibly even get food. The money that they spend on that boat, the time that they spend going out on the water and doing that fishing, those are indirect expressions of the value that they place upon water. So that's one way that we can think about it. But then there are the whole other set of passive use values that I spoke about, the cultural ones, the spiritual ones, the existence values. We don't have a way, we don't have an easy way to find those. And typically what must happen in those particular ways is we actually have to use a survey methodology. Diana has a survey where she looked at a little bit about what women were interested in, what people were interested in the community, in what's called preference elicitation, to give it the fancy words. In other words, finding out how much are people willing to pay. We basically confront them with a situation and say, here's situation A, your status quo. Here's an alternative. We can achieve that, but we need to know how much value you place on that. So it's literally directly asking people to make trade-offs between what is now and what could be. And so that's a way that we can kind of get at these passive use values.
Okay, very interesting. And I think one of the things that's sort of come up that we definitely want to have a conversation about is about the water health nexus. And, what impact does the water health nexus have on how water is valued? And maybe, Diana, if you want to start talking about your work first, and how that impacts the way that people, and especially women, value water. I know in your talk it really mentions that women have placed often in a different value than the men in their communities, and so how does that shape how we value water?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things before I started working in this area, or rather, I was working there on something different, and I would notice that this concept of water and disease just wasn't being taken like seriously, or it wasn't. They lacked the information to make this connection between water and disease, and and yet the area is really, really full of like waterborne diseases. Like I mentioned, I worked on schistosomiasis for many, many years. Malaria is rampant, even though it's not directly on the lake, but it's still waterborne. Around the lakes, the pools, the stagnant waters, that kind of thing. And you have diarrhea diseases. The children, you're doing a study, and so many kids are dying from diarrhea, and that connection just isn't there. Then it goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of like information. Information is very, very critical. So once you start informing these people, like, there's this link. There's a big link between your child is dying because of your water, suddenly that changes their concept of this water. Because initially it's just like, okay, it's water. I need water to wash clothes. I need water to, to clean the house. But once then you tell them, okay, it's not just that. It's you not just your children are dying because of diarrhea. A rest of people in the communities are dying because the mosquitoes are breeding in these stagnant water areas. Your men who are going to the lake, because for when we started working on something like schistosomiasis, you have men who spend hours and hours, in water contact on the lake, and they don't feel well. They're not well because like schistosomiasis is a debilitating disease. It's not a disease that, they get sick and they immediately know they are sick. And you're like, we tested you and most of you are sick. You're sick because of water contact. You're standing in this water for hours and hours, for days and days, and you're getting infected with this disease. So you provide this information, and suddenly the men in that lake start thinking, oh, wait a minute, there's a difference in just looking at this water like it's for fishing, it's also causing us this disease. So we need to look at it differently. The women, when they know, oh my goodness, we're losing our babies because of the water we're getting, suddenly the value of water changes, and it makes a big difference.
No, that connection by people realizing, the impact on their health. I can imagine that changes the use and the discussion, dramatically.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And Diane, how about in your work?
Certainly, I think similar things to what Diana has said. Water can have different impacts upon women's health. And I think I agree with her that education is part of what we need to be doing. I think a lot of people don't really understand necessarily some of the impacts of pollution upon their health and how there might be differential impacts upon men and women. And so we need to have a better understanding of, if you will, the linkages between decisions that are being made and then outcomes on individual people.
Well, I know we're reaching the end of this hour has just flown by, but the one question that I know, hopefully we'll get to answer a couple of questions here as well, but the final question that I wanted to ask you both is one about the fact that, we've discussed a little bit about how water is, intergenerational, and that the ways that people have valued water have changed over time. And so I'd like you to both close with your reflections on how do you think, in your work, the value of water has changed over generations, and what do you predict is going to be the most pressing water issue in your work in the next 10 years? So no small question to end on. And Diana, how about we start with you?
I think initially it was like, and we've touched on this, it was all about water access. And I think even Diane sort of talked about this, like, you know, the way water is taken for granted. And like in these communities, the problem was like, it takes too long to walk to the lake to collect water, or it takes too long to walk to the river to collect water. But as time has passed, like we mentioned, with knowledge, you get now changes in the way they look at this water. You know, they're now thinking about safe water with increased knowledge about water and sanitation. And then also, I think younger people are beginning to look at water as a shared resource in a different way. They're sort of looking even ahead. They're thinking like, okay, they're thinking more about water scarcity and climate change and how is it going to affect us? And that's their value of water is being affected by that, which the older generation, although they still worry much about water access, they're not thinking about like, how is this water going to be affected in the future? They look at, for example, in this region, they look at, oh, the lake is so big, we'll never run out of water. But younger people, I think, are looking ahead, and they're thinking, you know, this could be, you know, they feel vulnerable sometimes to the changes that may occur that may impact the water. They're thinking of industries. They're thinking, you know, this water could be so contaminated that, you know, we could actually run out of water. So I think there's that difference that's happening, where in the past it was just like, we need to access water, and now it's more complex, becoming more complex across generations. Yeah, that's the way.
The complexity definitely can.
Yeah, the complexity and the impact like of climate change. How is it going to affect water? And, you know.
And Diane, in your work, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge?
I think there's a lot of convergence in the work that Diana and I do, because I was going to say the very similar things. I think there's been a greater understanding of the role that water plays in our lives and the myriad ways in which it can impact not only our physical health, our mental well-being as well. And I think younger generations have a better understanding of the importance of water in their lives and the role of water. And so, and if I were to say what I think is the most pressing issue, I think it's got to be climate variability and how we're going to respond to the impacts of climate variability upon water, where there will be at once both too much water and too little water of the right quality. And so that's really where it gets very, very complex.
Well, it's certainly interesting to think about climate change and all the unknowns and the uncertainty that, you know, we can try to plan and try to think through what those challenges might be. But of course, many of the challenges are also still variables at this point. But thank you so much for this excellent discussion. I know we have reached the top of the hour here. We do have 2 audience questions that I would like to get to before we end the formal portion here. And the first question is from Susan Watt, who sends her greetings to both the panelists, and would like to know, you know, that given that there are many NGOs that have projects in developing countries, and many of the projects do basically have, you know, do not take into account these sort of international considerations. What kind of global and international development policies would you would enhance women's access to safe, reliable, and secure water?
I think Diana might have some ideas about that. Sorry, Diana, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
It's a difficult question because, like we mentioned earlier, you know, when you have global policies, they just need to take into consideration what's actually happening for all stakeholders. I think that's one of the biggest issues, because when interventions from, with global policies, like we mentioned earlier, you can say we have, sustainable development goals to give you safe, affordable water by, 2030 or something like that. But still, on the ground, it is very complicated to actually implement it successfully. So I think policies just have to take into consideration what is happening on the ground. Unfortunately, like Susan says, there are a lot of NGOs and organizations that they are very well-meaning, and they come in and they want to change the situation. But I think there's always that lack of hearing, almost like, are you including everybody in what you're trying to do? Or are you coming with a preconceived idea of listen, you need safe water and I'm going to bring it to you and I'm going to do this for you, and without actually listening, like what is possible, if you value water, what do they value? What do they need? What, how is it affordable? How is it sustainable also? There's the issue of sustainability. If you can come in with really good programs and good policies, but they may not be sustainable. So that really needs to be considered.
Could I just add to what Diana has said? I think understanding the local situation is so crucial. And if there are institutional barriers, shall we say, to the role of women generally in the society, that's a part of the role of how women are able or not to express their values for water. So it's a kind of a bigger issue than just women in water. It's women's role within a particular society. And so that requires institutional change, which doesn't happen very quickly.
Well, and I think that is a great lead into the last question, which will go to Gislaine Costa de Mendoza from Brazil, who has asked, and I think a great way to end today, which is how do we prioritize and strengthen women's networks within this dynamic? So given all of these, competing priorities from transboundary down to local, international development policies, et cetera, well, how do we strengthen, women's networks and their capacity to participate and to influence these types of decisions?
I think they have to know that they're stronger as a group, and that if they work as a group together, they can make their voices heard. And so anything that basically gives the women the authority, if you will, to have their voices heard and to be making those decisions. And I was quite struck by what you were saying, Diana, about the role of the rural women's groups in particular.
Yeah, there's an attempt to do just that, forming what they call women rural groups. Those can be really need to be they need to be strengthened and incorporate, knowledge that they can use to like you say, to know they have the capacity and they can make the change. I think sometimes that is lacking, because sometimes you form these groups. There are many groups, and we work with very many of the women groups as well. But the trainings that would empower them a lot more to do that is kind of lacking. It costs money to train these, the groups and everything, and sometimes that is lacking. But if that was strengthened, I think that would go a long way towards strengthening what they can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful discussion here and presentations. I think you've given us a lot to think about in the lead up to World Water Day. But I would like to thank everyone else for attending today's Women in Water lecture series. The next event will be held on April the 8th, 2021, and we will be discussing women in the field with guests Stephanie Powell, Lorelei Ford, and Lindsay Langs. Please register on the GWF website, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. And also, I would like to give a grand thank you to everyone who has worked behind the scenes to make this series possible. Stacey Demansky, Stephanie Merrill, Fred Reiben, Corin Schuster-Wallace, Yolande Chason, Ronald Fournier, and the interpretation, and Kimberly Nathaniel from National Captioning Canada for providing the captioning.